The Social Security Administration called me on a Thursday afternoon to inform me that my father, Walter Prescott, had died. A piece of information I already knew, painfully well, having sat beside his hospital bed and held his hand as he took his final breath 4 years earlier. Except the death the caseworker was calling about wasn't from 4 years ago. It was from that morning, when a Social Security fraud investigator, following up on an anonymous tip, had visited my father's supposed residence. A small house outside Tucson, where my stepmother, Linda, had continued receiving his monthly retirement and disability benefits for the past 4 years, and discovered, through a records cross-reference, that Walter Prescott had, according to Arizona's own vital statistics database, actually died 4 years earlier. On the exact same date I remembered from that hospital room, and that every single benefit payment Linda had collected since then, totaling just over $187,000, had been fraudulently obtained by a woman continuing to certify, year after year, that my father was alive and simply unable to manage his own affairs. I had not spoken to Linda in nearly 4 years, following a bitter falling out after my father's funeral. I had no idea, until that Thursday phone call, that she had never actually reported his death at all. Not to Social Security, not to his pension administrator, not to anyone beyond the small funeral home that had handled his cremation, whose own records, once investigators pulled them, confirmed exactly what I already knew to be true. If you're new here, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families, including, in today's story, a war fought over a death that had already happened, concealed for years by someone who understood exactly how to make a dead man appear on paper to still be quietly, plausibly alive. Today's story is called The Father Who Died Twice. Let's begin. My name is Diane Prescott Ellison. I'm 47 years old. I work as a high school science teacher outside Phoenix, and my father, Walter Prescott, was, for the first 43 years of my life, one of the steadiest, most reliable presences I've ever known. A retired Union Pacific Railroad engineer who spent 38 years working the Southwest rail lines before retiring with a modest but genuinely comfortable pension, alongside his Social Security retirement benefits that had provided him a stable, secure retirement he'd earned through decades of hard, honest work. My mother died of breast cancer when I was 26, and my father remarried, roughly 3 years later, to a woman named Linda Castellano, a relationship that, I want to be honest, I had complicated, difficult feelings about even from its earliest days. Not because Linda was ever outright unkind to me, but because I always sensed, in ways I struggled to fully articulate even to myself, a specific, guarded quality to her relationship with my father that felt, in retrospect, considerably more transactional than the genuine partnership my parents' own 31-year marriage had represented. My father's health began declining significantly roughly 6 years before this story begins, following a series of small strokes that gradually, cumulatively eroded his physical mobility, and to a lesser but still meaningful degree, his cognitive clarity, requiring increasing levels of daily care that Linda, as his wife, took on as his primary caregiver, a role I supported, and at the time, was genuinely grateful she was willing and able to provide. Given my own demanding teaching career, and the 4-hour distance between my home outside Phoenix and their house outside Tucson, I want to explain, honestly, the specific circumstances of the bitter estrangement between Linda and me that developed in the final year of my father's life, because it becomes directly relevant to understanding why I had so little visibility into what actually happened following his death. As my father's health continued declining, I grew increasingly concerned, during my periodic visits, about the quality of care he was actually receiving. Concerns that, in retrospect, I recognize now as early, if incomplete, warning signs of exactly the kind of situation that would eventually be fully confirmed. Though at the time, I understood them only as vague, difficult to articulate unease, rather than anything I could point to with real specificity. I raised these concerns with Linda directly, on several occasions, suggesting additional in-home care support or a more structured medical care plan given my father's clearly progressing condition. Suggestions Linda consistently, and with growing defensiveness, rejected, insisting she was fully capable of managing his care independently, and that my continued questioning reflected, in her words, a lack of trust that's honestly pretty hurtful, given everything I've sacrificed for him. This tension escalated significantly in the final months of my father's life, culminating in a genuinely bitter confrontation at his funeral reception, when I raised, one final time, my concerns about the quality of care he'd received in his final year. A confrontation that ended with Linda telling me, in front of several extended family members, that I was no longer welcome to contact her, and that she considered our relationship completely over. I want to be honest that I accepted that estrangement in the years that followed, with a specific, complicated mixture of relief and ongoing, unresolved guilt relief, given how genuinely difficult and draining our relationship had become in those final, tense months, and guilt about the possibility that I had failed my father in some way I couldn't fully identify. By not pushing harder against Linda's resistance, while he was still alive to potentially benefit from that pushing. I had no reason, throughout the following 4 years, to suspect that this estrangement was serving any purpose beyond the genuine, if painful, interpersonal breakdown it appeared to be on its surface. The Social Security Administration caseworker who called me that Thursday afternoon, a woman named Rebecca Torres, explained, carefully, and with what I could tell was genuine professional discomfort at delivering this specific, disorienting kind of news, that a fraud investigation, prompted by an anonymous tip received roughly 6 weeks earlier, had determined that my father had, in fact, died 4 years earlier, and that his Social Security benefits, along with investigators had separately confirmed his railroad pension, had continued being paid and collected throughout the intervening 4 years, deposited into a joint account Linda maintained, ostensibly on my father's behalf. I need to ask you directly, Rebecca told me, whether you have any knowledge of your father's death occurring 4 years ago, on the date our vital records show. I was there, I told her, my voice barely functioning through the specific, disorienting shock of this conversation. I held his hand when he died. I don't understand how any of this is possible. I assumed, this entire time, that all of the necessary paperwork and notifications had been handled, the way they're supposed to be handled after someone dies. Rebecca explained, over the following portion of our call, the specific mechanics of how this kind of fraud typically unfolds, and how it had apparently unfolded in my father's specific case. Linda had never formally reported his death to Social Security or to his pension administrator, a failure that, on its own, might initially appear to be simple oversight or administrative confusion during a genuinely difficult period of grief, except that Social Security's ongoing benefit verification process, periodic forms requiring confirmation that a benefit recipient remains alive, particularly for recipients receiving benefits based partly on disability or advanced age, required Linda, year after year, to actively, affirmatively certify that my father remained alive, forms that Rebecca's investigation confirmed Linda had, in fact, completed and submitted, falsely, on 4 separate annual occasions since his actual death. I want to walk through the specific, deliberate mechanics of what Linda had done, because understanding the genuine, sustained effort required to maintain a fraud like this for 4 full years illustrates something important about how far beyond simple passive inaction this situation had actually gone. Beyond the annual benefit verification forms, Linda had, according to the fraud investigation's findings, maintained the appearance of my father's continued, if severely limited, existence through several additional, deliberate mechanisms. Continuing to renew his driver's license through a state process that, Rebecca explained, in Arizona at the time, allowed for mail-based renewal under certain circumstances without requiring in-person verification, maintaining his enrollment in a Medicare Advantage plan that, given his supposed ongoing chronic health conditions, generated regular but low-scrutiny administrative correspondence rather than any active, in-person medical verification. And most disturbingly, according to a neighbor's account investigators eventually obtained, occasionally telling neighbors and infrequent visitors that Walter was simply having a difficult day or resting whenever anyone asked to see him directly, a pattern that had, apparently, successfully discouraged the kind of casual, in-person social contact that might otherwise have exposed his actual absence. I asked Rebecca, during that initial call, how a fraud of this specific, sustained scope had managed to continue undetected for 4 full years. A question I understood, even as I asked it, reflected my own genuine, painful bewilderment at how completely I had been kept in the dark. These cases are, unfortunately, more common than most people realize, and they can continue for surprisingly long periods precisely because our verification systems are largely designed around paperwork compliance rather than active, in-person confirmation, Rebecca explained. As long as the required annual certifications continue arriving, properly completed, and as long as no external red flag, a family member's inquiry, a neighbor's tip, an unusual pattern flagged by our own internal fraud detection algorithms, triggers deeper investigation, these cases can genuinely continue for years. In your father's specific case, it appears the estrangement between you and Mrs. Prescott. Rebecca used my father's surname, which Linda had, I would later learn, continued using throughout this entire period, may have inadvertently removed exactly the kind of ongoing, in-person family contact that might otherwise have surfaced this fraud considerably sooner. I want to describe the specific, disorienting process of confirming, through independent documentation, exactly what I already knew to be true, that my father had genuinely died 4 years earlier, on the date I remembered, because even amid my own clear, direct memory of that hospital room, the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of this entire situation left me needing, in the days following that initial phone call, to seek out concrete, external confirmation before I could fully process what was happening. I contacted the funeral home that had handled my father's cremation 4 years earlier, a small, family-run establishment outside Tucson that Linda had selected at the time, and confirmed, through their own retained records, the exact date of his death and cremation, precisely matching my own memory and precisely matching the date Rebecca's investigation had already independently confirmed through Arizona's Vital Records database. I want to describe something specifically unsettling I learned during this conversation with the funeral home director, a man named Robert Aguilar, who had personally handled the arrangements 4 years earlier. Linda had, according to Robert's records, specifically requested a considerably smaller, more private service than the arrangements I remembered attending, citing, at the time, my father's own supposed wishes for minimal ceremony, a detail that had struck me, even at the time, as somewhat inconsistent with what I understood of my father's own actual preferences, but that I had, in the raw grief of that period, not felt equipped to challenge. "I do remember your father's service specifically," Robert told me during our conversation. "It was a small gathering, maybe 15 or 20 people. I don't recall his wife ever mentioning any broader family notification process being needed, and I want to be honest, in retrospect, that struck me as somewhat unusual at the time, though it's not uncommon enough on its own for a funeral home to have any particular reason to flag it as concerning. I asked Robert whether the funeral home had itself filed the standard death certificate documentation with the state, a process I had, throughout the preceding 4 years, simply assumed had occurred automatically as part of any funeral home's ordinary administrative process. "We did file the initial certificate with the county," Robert confirmed, "which is what generated the vital records entry your investigator located. But funeral homes aren't generally responsible for notifying Social Security, pension administrators, or other benefit-paying entities directly. That notification responsibility typically falls to the surviving family member managing the deceased's affairs, in your father's case, presumably his wife." This detail, once I fully understood it, illuminated the specific, narrow administrative gap Linda had apparently identified and deliberately exploited. The funeral home's proper filing had created an accurate, if relatively obscure, county-level vital record, while the considerably more consequential notification to Social Security and his pension administrator, the notification that would have actually stopped his benefits from continuing, depended entirely on Linda's own voluntary action she had, deliberately, never taken. I want to spend some time on the anonymous tip that had originally triggered the fraud investigation, because it introduced an entirely unexpected, additional layer of complexity to this already disorienting situation. Rebecca, once I asked directly, explained that federal privacy regulations prevented her from disclosing the tipster's identity, but confirmed that the tip had specifically, and with unusual detail and specificity, described the exact nature of the ongoing fraud. Walter Prescott's actual death date, the continued benefit collection, and several specific details about Linda's living situation that suggested the tipster possessed genuine, direct, ongoing knowledge of Linda's current circumstances rather than simply general suspicion. This level of specificity, combined with my own complete absence of any contact with Linda over the preceding 4 years, led me to a specific, uncomfortable realization. Whoever had provided this tip almost certainly had considerably more current, direct knowledge of Linda's actual life and circumstances than I possessed, suggesting someone within Linda's own more immediate, ongoing social or family circle. Someone who had, for reasons I couldn't immediately determine, eventually decided to report what they knew. I would eventually learn, roughly 2 months into the broader investigation, through Rebecca's careful, indirect guidance about what information had become part of the public court record once formal charges were filed, that the tip had, in fact, come from Linda's own adult daughter from a prior marriage, a woman named Melissa Castellano, who I had met only briefly, years earlier, at my father and Linda's wedding, and who, according to the eventual court proceedings, had grown increasingly uncomfortable and concerned over the preceding several months about specific inconsistencies she'd noticed in her mother's finances and living situation, ultimately deciding, after considerable internal struggle, to report her concerns to Social Security's fraud hotline rather than confronting her mother directly. I reached out to Melissa directly, roughly 3 months into the investigation, once enough of the case's basic facts had become clear that I understood she had been the one to ultimately expose what her own mother had done. A conversation I approached with considerable uncertainty, unsure what kind of reception to expect from a woman whose own mother now faced serious federal fraud charges based substantially on her own reporting. Melissa, when we finally spoke, described a situation that added genuine, painful new dimensions to my understanding of what had actually happened. I didn't fully understand what was going on until relatively recently, Melissa told me during our first conversation. I knew Walter had passed away, obviously. I attended his funeral, the same as you did. What I didn't understand for years was that Mom had never actually reported it beyond that private, immediate funeral arrangement. I started noticing things maybe 8 months ago. Money that didn't add up given what I understood her actual income and pension to be. Evasiveness whenever I asked basic, ordinary questions about Walter's continued Social Security or pension status. A general pattern of secrecy about her finances that felt increasingly strange for someone in her position. I asked Melissa what had ultimately convinced her to report her suspicions, rather than simply continuing to wonder about them privately. I confronted her directly, actually, about 6 weeks before I called the fraud hotline, Melissa said. I asked her, point blank, whether she was still receiving Walter's benefits somehow. She got defensive, evasive, told me it wasn't my business, which honestly only confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. I sat with that for a long time before deciding what to do. I want to be honest that it was one of the hardest decisions of my entire life, reporting my own mother for something I knew would likely result in serious legal consequences for her. But I also couldn't keep living with the knowledge that she was actively, ongoingly committing fraud month after month, while I said nothing. The federal investigation, once formally opened following Melissa's tip, expanded considerably beyond the initial Social Security fraud question, ultimately involving the Railroad Retirement Board, which administered my father's pension separately from his Social Security benefits, alongside the FBI, given the interstate nature of federal benefits fraud and the total amount involved. I want to walk through the full scope of what the investigation ultimately determined, because the actual total, once every fraudulently collected benefit was accounted for, proved considerably larger than the initial $187,000 figure Rebecca had mentioned in our first conversation. Combining Social Security retirement benefits, Social Security disability supplements my father had also been receiving given his declining health in his final years, and his separate railroad pension, the investigation ultimately determined that Linda had fraudulently collected just over $241,000 in benefits she was not legally entitled to receive, spread across the 4 years since my father's actual death, deposited consistently into a joint account that investigators confirmed Linda had never closed or modified following his death, allowing the fraudulent benefits to continue depositing seamlessly alongside whatever legitimate income or assets Linda maintained independently. Investigators also determined, through a forensic accounting review of Linda's broader financial situation, that she had used a portion of the fraudulently collected funds to pay off a mortgage on the Tucson home she and my father had shared, a home that, under ordinary circumstances following his actual death, would have become part of his estate, subject to whatever inheritance provisions his will specified, provisions that I would learn once the estate question formally reopened as part of the broader investigation, had never actually been properly executed at all, since Linda had, functionally, prevented any formal probate process from ever beginning by never reporting his death to the appropriate authorities in the first place. I want to describe the specific, additional layer of complication this entire situation created regarding my father's actual estate, because it introduced a genuinely difficult legal question beyond just the criminal fraud investigation itself. My father's will, which I had understood at the time of his death 4 years earlier to have been properly filed and executed through the ordinary probate process, had, I now discovered, never actually been formally opened at all. a direct consequence of Linda's decision to never formally report his death, since the probate process that would have activated his will's provisions depends, procedurally, on a death being formally, legally recorded and reported in the first place. I retained an estate attorney, a probate specialist in Tucson named Margaret Cho, to help navigate this genuinely unusual situation, given how rarely, she explained during our first consultation, an estate remains entirely unopened for a full 4 years following someone's actual, confirmed death. This is a genuinely unusual case, Margaret told me, though not, unfortunately, entirely unprecedented. I've handled 2 prior cases involving exactly this kind of extended benefit fraud concealment, both of which similarly delayed the underlying estate's probate for years beyond when it should have properly opened. The good news, relatively speaking, is that your father's death itself is now formally, definitively established through the criminal investigation, which gives us a clear, unambiguous basis to finally open probate and begin distributing his estate according to his actual will, 4 years later than it should have occurred. My father's will, once Margaret helped formally open probate, specified a fairly standard, unremarkable distribution: the Tucson home and the majority of his remaining assets to Linda, as his surviving spouse, with a specific, smaller bequest to me consisting of a modest cash amount alongside several sentimental personal items. An arrangement, I want to be honest, I had no significant objection to at the time I originally understood it, back when I believed, 4 years earlier, that it had already been properly executed. The complication, now, was that the Tucson home Linda's spousal share would have entitled her to had been substantially paid off using fraudulently obtained federal benefits, creating a genuinely complex legal question about how much of that property's value should properly be considered part of the legitimate estate versus how much represented, functionally, the proceeds of ongoing federal fraud, subject to separate restitution and forfeiture proceedings connected to the criminal case. Linda was formally charged, roughly 5 months after the initial fraud investigation began, with federal benefits fraud, mail fraud connected to the false annual certifications she had submitted, and wire fraud connected to the electronic benefit deposits she had continued receiving, charges that, given the total amount involved and the sustained 4-year duration of the fraud, carried significant potential federal sentencing exposure. I want to describe what it felt like, navigating this criminal case as, functionally, both a victim of Linda's broader deception and a witness whose own account of my father's actual death date became directly relevant evidence in establishing the fraud's timeline and scope. I testified during Linda's eventual federal trial roughly 10 months after the investigation began, describing, as clearly and factually as I could manage, my own direct presence at my father's actual death 4 years earlier. Testimony that, combined with the funeral home's independent records and the medical examiner's original death certificate, established, beyond any reasonable dispute, the exact timeline the prosecution's broader fraud case depended on. Melissa also testified, describing, with visible difficulty and emotion, her own gradual discovery of her mother's ongoing fraud and her ultimate decision to report it. Testimony that, I want to be honest, I found genuinely difficult to witness, understanding the specific, painful position Melissa occupied throughout this entire process, testifying against her own mother in a federal criminal proceeding. Linda's defense, presented through her attorney, argued, throughout the trial, that her failure to report my father's death and subsequent continued benefit collection reflected genuine, prolonged grief-related dysfunction and administrative avoidance rather than deliberate, knowing fraud. An argument the prosecution countered directly and effectively through the specific, repeated pattern of Linda's affirmative annual fall certifications, each one requiring active, deliberate false representation rather than simple passive failure to act, a distinction the jury ultimately found persuasive. The jury convicted Linda on all charges, following a trial that lasted just over 2 weeks, and the sentencing judge, weighing the total amount defrauded, the sustained 4-year duration of the scheme, and the specific, deliberate nature of the repeated annual false certifications, ultimately imposed a sentence including a substantial period of federal incarceration, alongside a full restitution order requiring repayment of the entire $241,000 fraudulently obtained. An amount that, given Linda's limited independent assets beyond the now substantially encumbered Tucson home, would likely, Margaret explained, require the eventual forced sale of that property to satisfy at least a meaningful portion of the restitution obligation. I want to be honest about my own complicated feelings, hearing that sentence. A genuine, if painful, sense of vindication and accountability, layered alongside a specific, unresolved grief about a father whose actual death, and whose actual, intended final wishes regarding his modest estate, had been effectively hijacked and delayed for 4 full years by someone who had, apparently, prioritized ongoing financial benefit over even the basic, dignified administrative closure his death deserved. I want to spend real time on something I think this story illustrates in a way none of the other stories I've shared on this channel quite capture: the specific, strange experience of having my own grief process retroactively complicated and reopened, years after I believed I had already, largely, moved through the most difficult stages of mourning my father. I had spent the 4 years since my father's actual death gradually, genuinely healing from that loss, building a version of my life that had incorporated his absence, reaching a place of relative peace with his death, even amid the ongoing, unresolved sadness about the estrangement from Linda that had followed his funeral. Discovering, 4 years later, the full scope of what had actually happened during that period, that his death had never been properly, formally closed, that his estate had sat legally frozen and unopened, that his own final written wishes had never actually been executed, produced a specific, disorienting kind of grief reopening that my own therapist, once I began working with her specifically to process this new layer of the situation, described as a genuine, if unusual, form of complicated grief, triggered not by any change in the original loss itself, but by the discovery that the loss's aftermath had been fundamentally different from what you believed it to be. You're not grieving your father's death over again, exactly, my therapist told me, during one particularly difficult early session working through this new dimension of the situation. You're grieving the 4 years of delayed, distorted closure that should have followed his death and didn't, and you're processing a specific kind of betrayal about discovering that someone you trusted, even amid your estrangement, to at least handle the basic, dignified logistics of his death, chose instead to weaponize those logistics for ongoing financial benefit. That distinction, grieving the distorted aftermath rather than the original loss itself, became genuinely useful to me in the months of processing that followed, helping me understand why this discovery felt, in some ways, even more destabilizing than the original loss had been, despite occurring years later and despite my father's actual death itself remaining, factually, entirely unchanged by everything I'd learned. I want to describe how my relationship with Melissa developed in the months and years following the trial, because it became, unexpectedly, one of the more meaningful, if complicated, threads to emerge from this entire ordeal. Melissa and I maintained regular contact throughout the trial process, bonded by the specific, unusual shared experience of both being, in our own different ways, victims of and witnesses to her mother's sustained fraud. A connection that gradually, over the following 2 years, developed into a genuine, if inherently complicated, friendship. I think about you sometimes, and about your father in a way that surprises me, Melissa told me, during a conversation roughly 18 months after the trial concluded. I never really knew him well, beyond that one wedding all those years ago, but I feel connected to his memory now, in a strange way, because of everything that happened around his death, because I was the one who ultimately made sure the truth about it finally came out, even though that meant testifying against my own mother to do it. I told Melissa, honestly, that I would always be genuinely grateful for her decision to report what she discovered, however painful and complicated that decision had clearly been for her personally, and that I understood completely the specific, difficult courage it had required. I don't know if my mother will ever forgive me, Melissa said, during that same conversation, her voice carrying real, unresolved grief of her own. I understand why what I did was necessary, and I don't regret it, even given everything it's cost in my relationship with her. But I also carry my own genuine grief about that cost, alongside whatever relief comes from knowing I did the right thing. I've tried in the time since to hold space for Melissa's own complicated grief alongside my own, understanding that we each, in our own separate ways, lost something meaningful through Linda's choices. I lost 4 years of proper closure regarding my father's death and estate, and Melissa lost, in a very real and ongoing sense, whatever relationship she might otherwise have continued having with her own mother, a loss she chose, deliberately and at real personal cost. Because she understood it was the right thing to do. I want to describe something I did, roughly 2 years after the fraud was first discovered, once the criminal case and the estate proceedings had both substantially concluded. A small, deliberate ritual I created for myself, needing some way to finally, properly mark my father's death in a manner that felt authentic and complete, 4 years after his actual passing, and 2 years after finally learning the full truth about what had happened in the years since. I held a small, private memorial gathering, attended by a handful of close family and friends, at a spot along the Arizona rail lines my father had spent his career working, a location I selected specifically because it connected to the actual, genuine core of who he had been throughout his working life, rather than to any of the complicated, distorted circumstances surrounding the years following his actual death. I read, at that gathering, a version of the eulogy I realized, only in the process of writing it, that I had never actually properly, fully delivered at his original, small, private funeral service 4 years earlier. A service that I now understood Linda had deliberately kept small and limited, likely, I came to believe, as an early preliminary step in the broader concealment she was already beginning to construct, even in those first, raw days of genuine grief. I think I needed to finally say all of this out loud, in front of people who actually knew and loved you, the way I should have been able to 4 years ago, I said, near the end of that eulogy, my voice breaking in a way it hadn't during the original, smaller, more constrained service years earlier. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry you didn't get the proper, full goodbye you deserved from all the people who genuinely cared about you at the actual time you needed it. I hope, wherever you are, you know that this delay was never about how much we loved you. It was about someone else's choices, choices you never would have wanted, and choices we've finally, fully brought into the light. I want to return to Rebecca Torres, the Social Security fraud investigator, because a broader conversation I had with her, near the conclusion of the investigation, offered genuinely important context about how common this specific category of fraud actually is, and why it so often continues undetected for years. I want to give you some perspective on the scale of what we're dealing with, nationally, Rebecca told me, during one of our final debriefing conversations. The Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General identifies thousands of cases annually involving benefits continuing to be collected after a recipient's death, though the vast majority of these are relatively brief, involving a few months of overlap before a death is properly reported and benefits are stopped. Cases involving sustained, multi-year concealment like your father's are considerably less common, but they do occur with some regularity, and they share a specific, recognizable pattern I've come to recognize across the cases I've personally investigated. I asked Rebecca what that recognizable pattern typically looked like, beyond the specific circumstances of my own father's case. Almost universally, these sustained, multi-year cases involve a benefit recipient who lived independently or with a single, primary caregiving spouse, without extensive, regular in-person contact from other family members, she said. They almost always involve some degree of pre-existing family estrangement or geographic distance that reduces the likelihood of a family member's in-person visit surfacing the deception. And they almost always eventually come to light through exactly the mechanism that surfaced your father's case, not through our own routine verification processes, which are, frankly, more vulnerable to sustained fraud than most people realize, but through a tip from someone with genuine, direct, ongoing proximity to the person committing the fraud, someone who eventually notices an inconsistency significant enough to overcome their own reluctance to report a family member. I asked Rebecca whether she thought Social Security's verification processes needed meaningful reform, given what her own investigation of my father's case had revealed about the specific administrative gaps Linda had exploited. I think that's a genuinely important, ongoing conversation within our agency, she said. There's a real tension between building verification processes robust enough to catch sustained fraud like this more quickly, and avoiding processes so invasive or burdensome that they create genuine hardship for the overwhelming majority of legitimate benefit recipients and their families who aren't committing any fraud at all. I don't think there's a perfect, easy answer, but I do think cases like your father's are exactly the kind of example that should keep pushing that conversation forward, toward finding better, less burdensome ways to periodically, genuinely verify a benefit recipient's actual, ongoing status without creating excessive hardship for everyone else. I want to describe a separate, parallel thread of this story I haven't yet fully addressed. The Railroad Retirement Board's own internal investigation into how my father's pension had continued being paid for 4 years following his death, conducted alongside but somewhat independently of the broader federal criminal case. The Railroad Retirement Board's investigation, once I was able to review its eventual public findings through Margaret's assistance navigating the relevant public records, revealed its own specific administrative gap distinct from Social Security's verification process. My father's pension had, it turned out, been structured years earlier as a joint and survivor annuity. A common pension structure designed specifically to continue providing income to a surviving spouse after the primary pensioner's death. A structure that, under ordinary, legitimate circumstances, would have simply and appropriately continued paying Linda a reduced, survivor benefit level pension payment following my father's actual death, entirely legally and exactly as the pension's original structure intended. What made Linda's conduct fraudulent, rather than simply reflecting the pension's legitimate, intended function, was that she had continued claiming and receiving the full, non-reduced pension amount my father had received while alive, rather than the smaller, reduced survivor benefit she would have been legitimately entitled to following his death, a distinction that required her to actively, repeatedly misrepresent his continued survival, specifically to avoid the automatic downward adjustment her benefit would have otherwise triggered. This is actually one of the more common specific mechanisms in exactly this category of fraud, Margaret explained, once we'd reviewed the pension board's findings together. Many pension and benefit structures are specifically designed to provide some ongoing support to a surviving spouse, which means the fraud, in these cases, isn't creating income from nothing. It's specifically about fraudulently maintaining a higher benefit level than the person would have legitimately been entitled to receive as a surviving spouse, by concealing the very event that would have triggered the appropriate, legitimate reduction. This distinction mattered considerably to the final restitution calculation, since it meant the actual fraud amount, properly calculated, reflected the difference between the full benefit Linda had fraudulently continued receiving and the reduced, legitimate survivor benefit she would have been properly entitled to, a calculation that still resulted in a substantial fraud total. But one that required Margaret and the prosecution's own forensic accountants to work through with somewhat more nuance than a simpler case involving benefits Linda had no legitimate claim to whatsoever. I want to describe how I navigated explaining this entire, genuinely strange and difficult situation to my own two children, ages 16 and 13 at the time these events unfolded, because I think the specific challenge of explaining a situation this unusual to teenagers deserves its own attention. My older daughter, Katie, 16 at the time, had genuine, clear memories of her grandfather, having been 12 years old at the time of his actual death, and I want to be honest that explaining this situation to her required navigating both her own independent grief process and the genuinely strange, complicated additional layer of learning that the years since his death had been shaped by fraud she'd had no idea was occurring. "I don't understand how nobody knew for 4 whole years," Katie said, during one of our early conversations about the situation, a reaction that, I came to realize, mirrored almost exactly my own initial, bewildered response. I explained, as clearly as I could manage for a 16-year-old, the specific combination of administrative gaps, geographic distance, and family estrangement that had allowed the fraud to continue undetected for as long as it had, trying, throughout that explanation, to help her understand that the delay in discovery reflected specific, identifiable systemic and interpersonal factors rather than any failure of attention or care on our own family's part. My younger son, Charlie, only 9 at the time of his grandfather's actual death and 13 when this entire situation came to light, had considerably less independent memory of his grandfather to draw on, and processed the situation somewhat more abstractly, primarily, it seemed, as a genuinely fascinating true story about fraud and investigation, rather than as a deeply personal reopening of grief the way it registered for both Katie and me. "That's like something from a crime show," Charlie said, at one point, a reaction that, I'll admit, initially struck me as somewhat jarringly disconnected from the genuine gravity of the situation, before I came to understand and accept that a 13-year-old's more distant, less personally connected relationship to his grandfather's actual death naturally produced a correspondingly more distant, less emotionally weighted processing of the surrounding fraud. And that this difference in how my two children experienced the same family situation was itself simply a normal, expected reflection of their different ages and different degrees of direct personal connection to their grandfather's memory. If you're watching this, and you're currently navigating an estrangement from a family member connected to a parent's care or a shared loss, the kind of painful, complicated distance that sometimes develops around a loved one's final illness or death, I want to say something directly to you, informed by everything this specific, unusual ordeal taught my own family. Estrangement, however justified and however necessary it may genuinely be for your own well-being, can sometimes create exactly the kind of information vacuum that allows a genuinely concerning situation to continue undetected for far longer than it otherwise would. I'm not suggesting you should maintain a harmful or genuinely unhealthy relationship simply to preserve oversight. Linda's own choices, once fully understood, likely justified my estrangement from her considerably more than I realized at the time, even before I knew the full scope of what she'd eventually do. But I do think it's worth building in, where genuinely possible and safe, some alternative source of ongoing information or oversight. A trusted mutual family member, periodic official documentation requests, whatever specific mechanism might work for your own particular situation, rather than allowing a difficult, necessary estrangement to become an entirely blind spot regarding a parent's or loved one's actual, ongoing circumstances. And if you ever find yourself, as I did, receiving news this disorienting and this delayed about a loss you believed you had already fully processed, please know that the strange, complicated grief of discovering a distorted aftermath is a genuine, real form of grief, deserving of real, patient processing, even years after the original loss itself. You are not required to simply move on quickly from a discovery this destabilizing, however much time has technically already passed since the underlying loss occurred. My father died once, 4 years before I learned the full truth about everything that happened afterward. He deserved, and I deserved, to properly, fully grieve that loss at the time it actually happened, rather than having that grief distorted and delayed by someone else's choices for 4 additional years. I've finally, now, been able to give him and myself that proper goodbye, however many years too late it arrived. My name is Diane Prescott Ellison, and this has been another family hidden fight. If this story reminded you of a loss, an estrangement, or a truth you're still working to fully uncover in your own family's history, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us your own story in the comments. It might become a future episode. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.